So yes, ladies and gents, another video on James Cameron, because he's obviously doing the press tours. We don't get to hear too much from James Cameron. Loads of people are obviously surprised that there are so many videos on James Cameron, but we don't hear from him that much. And this is a storied director, a legend, who is now coming out and saying his current opinion on things, which is a bit of against the grain for some people. So yes, I freely admit that this is another video on James Cameron. But again, that's the reason why we don't hear too much from James Cameron outside of these kind of press tours. And when he says stuff like this, it does make you wonder, is he disenfranchised with the people that made his career? So James Cameron cut out 10 minutes of Avatar 2 gun violence because it made his stomach sick. And I quote, "I don't want to fetishize guns anymore." Interesting outlook. I think from a person that was so, I guess, masculine, macho, testosterone fueled with his films, it does seem to be a very interesting change of events. Some may say a complete 180. So let's take a look at this. Now, much of the conversation around James Cameron's long-awaited Avatar: The Way of Water has centred on its 3-hour runtime, which has hardly stopped the film from topping the box office charts. I've just done a video now where it's set to cross $1 billion. So it's a success, I'm not shitting on the film. I'm not. I have my personal opinion of it, but I can freely admit that it's been a success. In a new interview of Esquire Middle East, Cameron revealed, that's an interesting element, isn't it? We'll talk about that in a minute. So, in an interview with Esquire Middle East, Cameron revealed the film would have run 10 minutes longer had he not cut out scenes with gun violence. The filmmaker said he's no longer interested in fetishizing guns in his action scenes, given the rampant gun violence in the US. Now, he said this: "I actually cut about 10 minutes of the movie targeting gunplay action," Cameron said. "I wanted to get rid of some of the ugliness, to find a balance between light and dark. You have to have conflict, of course. Violence and action are the same thing, depending on how you look at it. This is the dilemma of every action filmmaker, and I'm known as an action filmmaker." And he said about, earlier in the interview, "I look back on some films that I've made, and I don't know if I would want to make that film now. I don't know if I would want to fetishize the gun, like I did on a couple of Terminator movies 30 plus years ago. In our current world, what's happening with guns in our society turns my stomach." You know what? I agree. Gun violence is awful, right? We can all agree gun violence is awful. Now, I'm not going to get into the pros and cons of people owning guns or anything like that. We don't need to, just to acknowledge that gun violence is awful, because it is. But there's an interesting hypocrisy around James Cameron talking about brutality and gun violence and, I guess, a moral compass with Esquire Middle East. Places that stone gays to death. It's a bit odd. There's definitely an air of hypocrisy to discussing moral compass with Esquire Middle East. Don't you think? I think so. It's interesting, to say the least. Talking about gun violence and ethics and moral code, what's going on in the world, to Esquire Middle East, of all places. Now, I know there'll be some people from the Middle East watching this. Sorry, state the lie. Now, he said, "I'm happy to be living in New Zealand, where they just banned all assault rifles 2 weeks after that horrific mosque shooting a couple of years ago." Which, yeah, sure. Again, sure. We can all agree gun violence is horrible. We're not getting into the pros and the cons. Gun violence, not good. Now, given Cameron's comments, it's safe to assume that action scenes in the Terminator franchise will look a bit different should it ever return to the screen. The director recently made headlines on the Smartless podcast after teasing that a new Terminator movie is being talked about. And the franchise has experienced one box office flop after another, which it absolutely has. And he said, if I were to do another Terminator film and maybe try to launch that franchise again, which is in discussion, but nothing has been decided, I would make it much more about the AI side of it than Bad Robots Gone Crazy, which that combined with his commentary on removing all gun violence from his films, because he doesn't want to fetishize guns anymore, I do think this speaks to someone who has become fairly out of touch with the core morals and ethics, and also what those individuals consider popular of the people that made him popular in the first place. I mean, you know, Terminator, Aliens, both films which they don't glorify guns. You know, there's nothing sexy about the guns in those films. You know, there's, well, I guess if you're talking about Aliens, the most sort of sassy element is where, and it's a scene-stealing moment, is where Ellen Ripley, dons the loader and says, "Get away from her, you bitch." Those are the scenes that stick out in your mind. Maybe the flamethrower, but the gun's not necessarily. The sound is iconic. The pulse rifle looks iconic. And the smart gun is iconic, but they don't necessarily glorify the gun. And I wouldn't either say Terminator does. So I do feel like James Cameron has become very out of touch with the core audience that made him who he is. And I think that there's a dangerous thing there where directors, and Ridley Scott is renowned for this, where directors become so sort of disenfranchised from everything. Massively disenfranchised. Because they sort of go on a philosophical quest, an introspective look at themselves. They reach such a pinnacle of success that they can afford to reflect on themselves. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, because it's good self-reflection. But it's also important to have some self-awareness around what made you what you are. And I don't think James Cameron has ever added to gun violence in the world. And I think that's important, I don't think... If you're having the discussion, it's fucking with Esquire Middle East as well, I mean, for goodness sake, about the moral and ethical compass of guns and ownership and sort of gun violence on a whole, it's important to question whether you have added and contributed to the gun violence in the world. Because if you haven't, then it goes to show, or if you believe you haven't, then it does go to show that you can continue doing what it is and still appeal to your core audience base. But I thought this was an interesting discussion piece. Please do let me know what you think down below. Love to hear any and all of your thoughts.